Welcome to AI Horror Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 5 spine-chilling tales that'll make you question what lurks in the shadows. From a vampire's glare to a cursed broadcast, these stories will keep you up all night. So, grab a blanket, dim the lights, and let's unravel the unseen terrors together. Don't forget to subscribe for more creepy tales. First story: The Window. Many years ago, there was an old one-story house that stood at the top of a hill. The locals called it Croglan Grange, and 3 young people lived there. A girl and her 2 brothers. One hot summer's night, they were all sitting out on the veranda, enjoying the cool air. They watched the sun set, and as the moon was rising over the trees, they decided to go to bed. A few hours later, the girl was lying in bed, unable to sleep with the heat. She was gazing out the window, watching the moon move across the sky, when something suddenly caught her eye. She saw 2 small lights moving through the woods near the graveyard at the bottom of the hill. They looked like the eyes of some strange animal, but she couldn't make out what kind of animal it was. She kept her eyes on the woods, and then something stepped out of the shadows, something ghastly. It was coming up the hill towards the house. For a few minutes, she lost sight of it. Then she saw it coming across the lawn towards her window. It looked something like a man, and yet it didn't. As she watched it, the most uncontrollable horror seized her. She wanted to run from her room, but the door was right next to her window, and she was afraid the creature would see her. She wanted to scream, but her tongue felt like it was glued to the roof of her mouth. She rushed to the door, but before she could open the lock, she heard a scratch, scratch, scratch at the window. When she turned around, she saw a hideous shrunken brown face with flaming eyes glaring in at her. She tried to scream, but she was so frightened that she couldn't make a sound. The creature broke a pane of glass in the window. Then, it reached in with long bony fingers, unlocked the window, and crawled inside. The girl tried to escape, but the creature caught her by the hair. It dragged her over to the bed, then pulled back her head and sank its teeth into her throat. She let out a blood-curdling scream and fainted. When her brothers heard her scream, they rushed to her room, but they couldn't get in because the door was locked. By the time they managed to break down the door, the creature was gone. Their sister was lying unconscious on the bed, bleeding from the wound in her neck. While one of the brothers grabbed a towel and tried to stop the bleeding, the other took off after the creature and chased it down the hill. The thing fled through the moonlight, taking enormous strides, and soon he lost sight of it near the graveyard. The brother went back to the house to see if he could help his sister. The girl was scared and badly hurt, so they took her to hospital where her wound was disinfected. The doctor put a bandage around her neck, and she had to stay in hospital for a few days. Gradually, the wound began to heal, and the doctor said she was well enough to go home. The brothers reported the incident to the police, but they couldn't figure out what had happened. They said it was probably a lunatic who escaped from the local asylum. The brothers didn't want the girl to come back to the house and stay in the same room, but she insisted. After all, she said, lunatics don't escape from the asylum every day. But just in case, the brothers slept in the room across the hall and kept loaded pistols on their bedside tables. The winter passed peacefully and happily, but one night, a couple of months later, the girl was awakened by a scratching sound at the window. When she opened her eyes, she saw the same hideous, brown, shrunken face staring in at her. This time, she screamed as loud as she could. She screamed with all her might, and her brothers grabbed their pistols and came running. The creature took off, but the brothers chased it down the hill. One of them took aim and fired a shot at it, hitting it in the leg. The creature fell over, but it got up and managed to limp over to the graveyard wall. The brothers watched as it scrambled over the wall and seemed to disappear into an old burial vault. The next day, the girl and her brothers went down to the church and demanded that the priest open up the burial vault. Inside, there was a horrifying scene. The coffins had been broken open, and bones and rotting flesh were scattered all over the floor. Only one of the coffins had been left intact. When they opened it, there lay the same hideous, withered and shriveled creature that had attacked the girl. When the priest examined the corpse, he found a bullet in its leg. They did the only thing they knew of to rid themselves of a vampire. The priest built a roaring blaze outside the vault. Then, the brothers dragged out the shrunken body and tossed it on the flames. They watched the corpse burn until there was nothing left of it but ashes. Second story: The last transmission. On a stormy night, the local Clearwater radio station began its nightly broadcast, a mix of melancholic music and horror stories narrated by its charismatic host, Alex. However, tonight would be different. Alex had received a series of anonymous recordings that promised to be the perfect material for his Halloween show. What he didn't know was that these recordings hid more than just fictional stories. As he played the tapes, listeners were immersed in chilling tales of apparitions, mysterious disappearances, and encounters with the inexplicable. But as the night progressed, something began to feel strangely real in the voices on the recordings. Listeners began calling, reporting strange occurrences around them, shadows moving on their own, objects disappearing, and a feeling of being watched. Intrigued and slightly uneasy, Alex decided to investigate the origin of the recordings, discovering that they all came from an abandoned house on the outskirts of Clearwater, known as the Blackwood Mansion. Local legend said that the mansion was cursed, inhabited by the spirit of its former owner, who had practiced dark rituals seeking immortality. Determined to discover the truth, Alex brought his team recording session at the Blackwood Mansion, live-streaming what he hoped would be the culmination of his special Halloween show. Upon arrival, the heavy atmosphere and unearthly silence confirmed the legends surrounding the place. Exploring the mansion, Alex began to feel a chilling presence, as if every step inside it will take you deeper into a world of shadows. Then, in the heart of the house, he found an old recording studio, filled with tapes that appeared to be the originals of the ones he had received. When playing one, the voice that sounded was not that of a horror story, but a direct message to him, warning him about the danger of waking up what should remain asleep. The transmission became chaotic, with inexplicable sounds and whispering voices interrupting the signal. Terrified listeners reported that the storm had increased in intensity, as if it were responding to the energy unleashed by the broadcast. At the climax of the night, a shadowy figure appeared in front to Alex, his identity hidden in the shadows, but his voice, clearly audible through the broadcast, declared the end of the Blackwood curse, released by the station's final broadcast. The next day, the radio station was found silent, with no sign of Alex or his team. Blackwood Mansion, on the other hand, seemed to have regained some of its former glory, with the storm dissipated and an air of eerie peace surrounding her. Alex's last broadcast became legend, an eternal reminder of the power of stories and the price of unearthing secrets that should have remained hidden. And in Clearwater, every Halloween, it is said that echoes of that transmission can be heard, carried by the wind, like a whisper from the past that refuses to be forgotten. Third story: The White Gown. There was a young woman who was very lonely. She desperately wanted to find herself a boyfriend. The only problem was that she had very little money, so she never went anywhere and never met anybody. One day, she received an invitation to a party at an expensive hotel. The girl really wanted to go, but she didn't have any nice clothes to wear for such an occasion. She didn't even have enough money to buy a new dress. "Why don't you buy a dress in the second-hand shop?" her mother suggested. The girl went down to a second-hand shop not far from where she lived and managed to find a beautiful white satin evening gown. It fit her perfectly and the price was surprisingly cheap. She immediately bought it and rushed home. That night, when she arrived at the hotel, the girl looked so radiant and attractive that all eyes were on her. Every single young man at the dance was desperate to meet her. She danced with one handsome man after another and was having a wonderful time. She began to feel that her luck was changing for the better. Soon, however, she began to feel dizzy and faint, and she had trouble staying on her feet. She asked one of the young men to help her downstairs and get her into a taxi. When she got home, the girl crawled up the stairs and lay down on her bed. The next morning, the girl's mother knocked on her bedroom door, but there was no answer. When the woman opened the door, she found her daughter lying lifeless on the bed. She called the doctor, but it was no use. By the time he arrived, the girl was already dead. The doctor examined her, but he couldn't understand what had killed her, so he asked the coroner to perform an autopsy. It turned out that the girl had been poisoned by embalming fluid. Tests were done and traces of embalming fluid were found on the white gown. Because she was dancing so much, the girl started sweating and the embalming fluid entered her pores and slowly stopped her blood from flowing. Police questioned the owner of the second-hand shop. He said he had bought the white satin evening gown from an undertaker's helper. He had stolen it from the body of a dead girl, just before she was buried. Fourth story: footsteps. From the time I was old enough to notice things, I didn't like that house. I was afraid of the upstairs. I never felt safe there. Mama always kept the light burning at bedtime because I was afraid of the dark. One evening, when I was 9, my sister was downstairs and I was asleep in bed. She was expecting Mama to come home at any moment. When she heard the front door open, my sister called out, "Hello, Mama," but there was no answer. She heard footsteps, but they didn't sound like Mama. Her footsteps were light, but these were heavy, like a man. "Who's there?" my sister called, but there was no reply. The footsteps continued up the stairs and wandered into all the bedrooms, but, when my sister called out again, "Who's there?" the footsteps stopped. She was young and afraid, but she knew I was sleeping alone up there, so she took the lamp and searched all the rooms. She even went into the attic, but she didn't find anyone. My sister went back down to the dining room, but as soon as she sat down, the footsteps started again. They came down the stairs, through the dark kitchen, and then the door of the dining room where my sister was sitting slowly began to open. She was scared out of her wits. "Get out," she screamed. The door slowly closed and the footsteps moved out through the kitchen, towards the front door. She heard the door open and shut, so she ran to the window to see who it was. There was nobody in sight and there were no footprints in the fresh snow. That was when she realized that whoever or whatever had walked in, it wasn't human. She huddled on the couch and waited for Mama to come home. Not long after that, we moved out, but something strange happened before we left. My sister and I were in the living room when, all of a sudden, we heard terrible groans. It sounded like someone was in agony. The groans seemed to be coming from the cellar. They were so loud that our dog started howling and the hair stood up on the back of her neck. She would always go anywhere with me, but when I tried to coax her to come down into the cellar with me and investigate, she wouldn't go. The cellar was well lighted, so my sister and I went down, following the groans until we came to a little alcove and there the groans ceased. I wanted to dig right there on the spot, but there was no time. I've always felt that if we had, we would have found the cause of all our trouble. Perhaps someone's bones were buried there. We moved away soon after that, and Mama would never let me ask the people living there today if they had heard anything. We were all glad to get out of that house. Fifth story: the cargo ship. Years ago, I signed up as an ordinary seaman on a cargo ship traveling to England. On this particular voyage, the crew were a tolerable bunch, all except for one hard-looking character named McLaren. He was a fair seaman, but there was something about the cut of that fellow's jib that I just didn't trust. He didn't get along with the others and they didn't get along with him. Even at meal times, he wouldn't associate with the rest of us. He just wolfed down his food like a dog, then got up and left without a word. He was very secretive, kept mostly to himself and always acted in an aggressive manner. There were a couple of times when I caught him giving me dirty looks, as if he was just itching for a chance to knife me in the back. One dreary afternoon, while we were trying to work, a thick fog set in on us. It was a black, dripping fog and you could scarcely see the length of the vessel. It soaked up all the light, to the point where you'd think we didn't have any lights on at all. The sea was dead calm and there wasn't so much as a breath of wind in the air. The ship was rolling slowly along as the captain steered his course. The deck of the cargo ship was silent and no man said a word. Then, all at once, there was a mighty whack. Something hit the deck and the force of it almost jarred the entire ship. It landed with a thump right in front of McLaren. He let a screech out of him that would turn the blood cold in your veins. The second mate started yelling that somebody had fallen from a loft, and the captain fetched a lantern from his cabin so we could see who it was. McLaren had fallen over the wheel in a dead faint, his arms hanging limp and swinging back and forth with the motion of the ship. By the light of the lantern, we could see someone or something lying out there on the deck, just in front of the wheel. Whatever it was dressed in oilskins, and there was a big pool of blood dribbling out from underneath it. Every one of us was afraid to approach it. We all knew nobody was supposed to be up in the crow's nest, so none of us could explain how a body ended up falling and landing on the deck. Eventually, some of the crew mustered the courage to turn over the corpse and take a good look at its face. Peering over their shoulders, I saw it was a big, ugly-looking man, but I didn't recognize him at all. In fact, there wasn't a soul on board that knew who he was or what he had been doing up there. When McLaren recovered from his faint, we tried to question him about it, but all he could do was jabber away incoherently and keep rolling those big, wild-looking eyes of his. Seamen are a superstitious bunch at the best of times, and everyone on board was getting more and more frightened. They all wanted to heave the body overboard as quickly as they could. There was something weird about it. Something definitely was not quite right. The captain thought the man might be a stowaway, but the ship was so full of lumber that there was no place for a man to hide. Whoever the dead man was, he hadn't been on the ship when we pulled out of port. The second mate gave orders to throw the corpse over the side, but the crew were convinced there was something supernatural afoot, and all of them were afraid to touch it. The second mate was shouting at this one and that one, but he couldn't coax anyone into moving a muscle. All of a sudden, McLaren started yelling like a lunatic and ran out onto the deck. "I've handled him once, I can handle him again," he cried, and he picked up the corpse and dragged it over to the railing. Just as he was about to heave it over the side, the thing reached out with its two big, long arms and wrapped them around him. Before anyone knew what was happening, the pair of them went over the rail together. Just as they did so, up came the most horrible laugh any of us had ever heard. The crew gathered around, staring bug-eyed at the terrifying scene. The second mate was yelling at us to launch a boat and rescue McLaren, but nobody would dare to get into a boat, not after what they had just witnessed. We threw a couple of life preservers over the side, but we all knew nothing on God's green earth would save him now. Later on, the captain told us that, on the last trip he had made, there was a really big fellow who had been always picking on McLaren and pushing him around. There was bad blood between them, and McLaren was always making threats about how he would someday get his revenge. One wet and dirty night, the two of them were up in the crow's nest alone. In the middle of the night, the big fellow somehow fell and struck the deck like a ton of bricks. When they found him, he was stone cold dead, said the captain. Deader than 40 herring. When they questioned McLaren about it, he said it had all been a terrible accident. The rope ladder they were using suddenly snapped and the big fellow plunged to his death. McLaren claimed he might have fallen himself, but for the grace of God. However, nobody believed his story. Everyone who saw the rope ladder knew it didn't give away on its own. The rope had been cut through with a knife, but they couldn't prove anything, so they had to let the matter drop. In the end, I guess the big fellow took care of things in his own way, said the captain. 5 tales, 5 nightmares, proof the unseen is always watching. Which story chilled you most? Tell us below, hit that like button, and subscribe to AI Horror Stories for more.